remember to check. Or, oh, it is being recorded now, so don't say anything you don't want everyone to hear. Will we see people pop up as participants? Oh, yep, they're joining in.
Yeah, since I'm the host, I can see that. So we got a lot of folks joining us here. We're going to start in about 5 minutes. We'll start right at 2:30. So go ahead and get settled, and we'll get started here in a few.
Jonathan, I'm not sure I understand your question. Oh, you know what? You guys won't have microphones because this is a webinar. So if you have questions that you want to ask, you can do it in the chat.
Yeah, and these webinars are a little confusing. There's two places. There's a chat, and then there's a Q&A section. So wherever you feel comfortable typing any questions in there, we'll be able to see them and pop them up there.
So the next question is, will the recording be posted? We plan to post it as long as everything goes well. This is the first time that Brian and Helena and I have actually hosted a webinar. So we're assuming that we're going to do everything correctly so that we can post the recording, but if possible, there could be a glitch. So we'll do our best. The webinar is about plastics in the environment. So we'll be covering the problem. We'll be talking about the way each of our disciplines approach the problem, and we'll be talking about causes and potential solutions to the problem. And we appreciate you all joining us. We'll get started in about 3 minutes. Good afternoon to everyone who just joined us. We'll get started in about 2 minutes. Thanks for joining us. Good afternoon to everyone who just joined us. Thanks for being here today, and we'll get started in about 1 minute. All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Christine Witkowski. I teach sociology here at Midlands Tech, and I'm joined by Helena Ferguson, who teaches anthropology, and Dr. Brian Grabiton, who teaches geography. We are delighted to be able to share our passion about applying our disciplines to a very specific social problem, which is a big one of a magnitude on par with global climate change, which was the topic of our last social science forum. So thank you for joining us today. What we plan to do today is cover the problem and what it is. We'll get into some of the details about sort of the magnitude of the problem. We'll then talk about how each of our disciplines approaches solving a problem or addressing a problem like this. We'll then talk about the causes of the problem of plastics in the environment and some potential solutions. We'll talk about some organizations working on the issue, some things you can do. So we'll cover a lot of ground today. We welcome questions along the way. So my colleagues and I will take turns monitoring the chat and the Q&A. So there's no microphone since this is a webinar, but you're welcome to post questions or comments in the Q&A or in the chat. And we'll get to those as soon as we're able to fit them into what we're talking about. I encourage you guys definitely to ask questions and make comments along the way. So please do. So our first introduction here will be about how much plastic are we talking about? According to the United Nations Environment Program, there's more than 8.3 billion tons of plastic that's been produced since the early 1950s when we first started generating plastics. Humans produce approximately 300 million tons, which is about 330 million US tons of plastic waste every year. And what does this look like? Well, over time, we've increasingly produced. So in the 1950s, we were producing almost no plastic. By the 1980s, we were producing, somewhere to the tune of about 75 million tons. And today we're producing just a massive amount of plastics. And this is a problem in places where the plastic gets disposed of, sometimes properly, sometimes improperly. It's also a problem in the places where the plastics are being produced. So Brian, I'm going to let you talk about this slide.
Can you go back for a second to that last one?
Sure.
Yeah, one of the things that I wanted to kind of point out here is, as a geographer, we like to think about sort of commodity chains kind of from end to end and the different places that they touch, right? Everything from extraction to production to consumption and disposal. And so, you're looking at those numbers there that Christine's walking you through and just the astounding growth of plastics production, but just to also consider how it's made and what the issues are in the places where it's made. So, two types of plastic. There's synthetic, which is basically a byproduct of different fossil fuel extraction. It's made from natural gas, coal, or petroleum. And then sort of the bio-based, which is kind of those newer plastics we're now hearing about that are more biodegradable, that are made out of plant material. But that image on the right is signaling that in the places that make these plastics, where they're also refining these fossil fuels, you've got really bad health impacts on the community as well as environmental impacts. And so that image over there is from this section of the Mississippi River that runs from Baton Rouge to Louisiana that is nicknamed Cancer Alley, where in some communities you've got 50 times the cancer rates than on the national average in these places where this production occurs. So just to think a little bit about kind of how this stuff starts and the impact in making the plastic to begin with. And if you flip to the next one, Christine, just a couple of charts to think about. Consumption. So, who is using the plastic? What is it used for? And so on the left, you've got the types of products or sectors of industry where these plastics are used. And you see that packaging is the top one here, right? I mean, it's more than twice as much as the second ranking thing. So we're talking about disposable items here, right? We're talking about straws and containers and food that we buy that's wrapped and toys that we buy that's wrapped. And so it's all about kind of, packaging up these commodities and getting it to us, right? Not just the plastic that's in the stuff we use. On the right is plastic waste generation per person. So it takes the amount of plastic that's generated and then consumed in different countries of the world and shows you, if you break it down per person, right, who are the worst offenders. And so, the US stands out here, Germany stands out, Belgium stands out, Ireland. And then we've got sort of a couple more that are sort of oddities, like Guyana in South America for some reason. I can't figure that one out. Venezuela, which makes sense because it's a big oil producing country, South Africa, highly developed country, and then Sri Lanka, which is also sort of another kind of strange one to me. But seeing some of these patterns in terms of plastic waste per person, I think is somewhat telling. And I think what we're going to do is kind of run through these slides, and we can certainly come back and talk about these things more later, but just kind of introduce them a bit now. Is that right?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah.
So what happens to all this discarded plastic? Because, much of it has end life. And the reality is only a small percentage of plastic, once it reaches its end life, is recycled. So approximately 8.7% of discarded plastic in the US in 2018 was recycled. Globally, only about 18% of plastic waste is recycled. And we can revisit this issue later when we talk about causes of the problem, because there's this misconception that plastic can be recycled. It's a misconception which was purposefully pushed on the public by the plastics industry. And I'm not trying to demonize the plastics industry, but they really convinced us to believe that we could solve all this waste problem through recycling. And the reality is many of the industry leaders recognized even back in the 1990s that it wasn't pragmatic from an economic perspective to recycle plastic, because it's cheaper to produce plastic from virgin materials than it is from recycled materials. So for the entire last, several decades, we've had this misperception that recycling was going to happen, and it really isn't. So what happens to it? Well, some of it's incinerated, approximately 24%. Obviously, this contributes to a significant amount of air pollution. The toxins in that incinerated or incineration smoke are really problematic. You also end up with toxic ash as an end product. About 58% of the discarded plastic ends up in landfills. And in landfills, there's no opportunity for degradation, really, because there's no exposure to oxygen. So it could take, estimates are up to 1,000 years for it to decompose or degrade. If it even happens then, it's questionable. And this can all lead to leaching of potentially toxic substances into the soil and water, or, in the environment generally. Approximately 8 billion tons of plastic also ends up in the world's oceans every year because of improper disposal in places that actually have disposal systems. And in those places that don't have disposal systems, it's not even improper disposal, it's just that they don't have anywhere to put it. So a lot of it ends up in the waterways and ultimately from the watersheds to the oceans. So Brian, I'll let you talk a bit about this slide.
So yeah, that chart on the left is showing what you just talked about, Christine, in terms of percentage incinerated, percentage recycled. Now these are global statistics, so apparently some places are doing better than us, at least according to this data set, because you said about 8 to 9%, right, is getting recycled, and globally it's closer to 20 of the total. But you see that
was about 9% in the US and 18% globally.
Okay, yeah, so that data, give or take a few percentage points is pretty aligned there. I mean, you can see that the amount recycled has increased over time, right? The amount incinerated has increased faster. So but it's still a pretty small percentage. And then on the right kind of shows you the global perspective on this, which is, you know, if this stuff is some of it's getting incinerated, some of it's getting recycled, what happens to the rest of it? It shows you where this plastic ends up, right? So you've got the top exporters, of which the US is one, and then you've got the top importers, which prior to 2018, the top importer would have been China, but they essentially decided that they were not going to take it anymore. It was causing lots of pollution issues, lots of human rights issues. And as much as we like to sort of think about the Chinese government as not caring about those kinds of things, they've had sort of a concerted effort over the last 10 years or so to try to mitigate some of the environmental concerns, right, in their country. So we've got this shift away. Something that I found interesting in looking at that was one of the reasons why China was taking our recycling is because they were sending us so much stuff in these shipping containers, and they were coming back empty. And so they're like, well, just send your recycling back and then we'll figure out what to do with it. And in 2018, they cut us off from that. So these other countries have filled the gap. You know, Malaysia, Thailand, Vietnam stand out there. A lot of our plastic also goes to Mexico. A lot of our plastic also goes to Kenya. So we're looking at the global flow of that waste here on these images. Yeah.
So I want to clarify, Brian, this is top plastic waste exporters and waste importers, correct? Not raw plastic like pellets or what have you.
No, this is you're saying raw, like, you know, stuff
like as in to turn it into
recycled or to be incinerated or to be discarded in a landfill. I guess it depends on where you are as to what happens with it when it gets there.
Right.
But this is stuff that's, you know, out of sight, out of mind for the exporters, and very much all of a sudden in these countries in Southeast Asia in particular.
And we'll come back to that issue of China no longer accepting the world's plastic recycling materials later, because I think that's important in understanding the causes of the problem. So the world is awash with plastic, as it were. These are where plastic waste inputs from land into the ocean are highest. So, you know, the United States definitely is a major contributor to plastics in the ocean, but there's other places in the world that contribute far more. And what you'll notice is a lot of these places are places that don't really have a good waste disposal system, and so a lot of the plastic ends up in the ocean because there's just nowhere else for it to go in terms of having a social structure built in place to accept that waste. So a lot of the plastic waste ends up in the ocean. There's these huge, what are called plastic islands that develop in the ocean because of something Brian will talk more about called gyres in the ocean. And they're not really islands because they're sort of amorphous and they're moving around, but they can be very, very deep into the ocean, and they're very sort of loose and floating around and massive. And this accumulation of plastic waste causes all kinds of problems, whether it's accumulated into one of these so-called plastic islands or whether it's just floating around. It leads to entanglement of wildlife. Something called ghost fishing. So fish end up being caught on these old discarded lines or in nets, but they never get harvested. So they just get killed but never used. There's ingestion by wildlife, which can lead to starvation. There's smothering. So imagine, you know, thinking that a plastic bag is a jellyfish and you're eating it. Well, it smothers you or suffocates you. It enters the food chain, especially when it breaks down into smaller particles, but not exclusively then. It has the potential bioaccumulative effect of toxins because of all this plastic being in the food chain. And then one that I hadn't really thought about until recently, but it's becoming more visible as a problem, is this plastic ends up serving as sort of rafts so that species from one part of the world can get relocated to other parts of the world. And this leads to a lot of exotic species introductions. And if there's no natural predators for those species in the area that they relocate to, they can become very, very invasive. So those are sort of ocean related problems. And this visual just gives you a sense of the sort of how dire the problem is. On the left is one of these amorphous, loose floating masses of plastic. And on the right are some of the microbeads, which we can talk more about later, but microbeads have become a component of many products. And they're little tiny particles of plastic, which are often misrecognized as food by other species within the food chain. Brian, do you want to talk about the gyres and the watersheds a little?
This slide has an animation in it that didn't quite show up, so I'm going to switch screens real quick.
Okay.
That doesn't cause too much trouble, but I'll talk about the image on the left first, and then we'll talk about the gyre. So on the left is just a really complex, but hopefully somewhat pleasing image of our watersheds. So it's just reminding us that, you know, each of those different color chunks is a place where water drains to a common point. So the big one in the blue there in the center of the US is the Mississippi, where all of the water between the Appalachian Mountains and the Rocky Mountains kind of drains into a single source. So, you know, when this pollution gets into the environment, obviously it gets carried downstream and then ends up in the oceans eventually, right? And along that journey, it can also get turned into those microplastics, right? Because you've got the force of water and the friction force against the bottom of these rivers and against these rocks, and that's sort of breaking it down. So it might not look like a lighter or a straw by the time it gets to the ocean. It might be something smaller that can be ingested. These gyres do the same thing. So in the ocean, you've got surface currents. And can y'all see this screen now? Yeah.
Yes,
you've got
right.
surface currents that carry surface water roughly like east to west at the equator, but then those currents get deflected by the continents and they become these circular patches. And so if I play this animation here, this is from NASA, and what they're doing is they're tracking some of the buoys that they've sent out to monitor all sorts of things, everything from ocean salinity to temperature to pollution. And you start to see them kind of accumulate and then get into these gyres out in the open ocean. So now you're seeing all the buoys they've released since the 1980s kind of all at once. And they'll reset it here in a second and release all of those buoys at the same time digitally. And you'll see the pattern that they take. So this is where all those buoys started out. And then they get caught up in the ocean currents and they start to get into that circular motion kind of out in the deep ocean. And they begin to collect. And so these are the places where those currents naturally kind of swirl together and they collect those large patches of garbage that you saw the photo from a moment ago. So, you know, the surface currents naturally would sort of gather together debris, sediment, et cetera. But what they're collecting now are these massive, you know, islands of plastic bags and all the rest.
So I want to guarantee that those of you who are saying, what can we do about this? We will definitely talk about some potential solutions after a while, but we just want to get through sort of what is the problem right now. So I might run into a problem with my Zoom here, so I hope that I pick the right one. Share screen. Okay. So next slide. So what about on land? Well, according to the United Nations Environmental Program, plastic pollution arguably poses a bigger threat to the plants and animals, including humans, who are based on land. So we oftentimes hear about this being an ocean-related problem, but it's also a problem on land. And the same sorts of issues occur: entanglement by wildlife, ingestion by wildlife, smothering, entering the food chain, contributing to groundwater pollution. I was recently reading about the contribution to soil pollution as well, and then the potentially toxic effects on living species as these toxins accumulate up the food chain, what we call bioaccumulation. There's also the potential for harm to human health. So I was looking at some scientific reports about the latest data on the health to humans. And I want to read a couple of these quotes because I think they're pretty impactful. So varieties of plastic used in the production of many consumer products, including medical devices, food packaging, and water bottles, contain toxic chemicals like phthalates, heavy metals, bisphenol A, brominated flame retardants, I won't say this one right, not nalphenol, and so on. So there's a lot of toxins in them. And long-term exposure to plastics and plastic products to high temperatures can lead to leaching of these toxic chemicals into our food, our drinks, our water, as can open air burning lead to toxic chemicals in the air. So there's a lot of potential health impacts, and we're really only starting, science is really only starting to understand the magnitude of these health problems. There's, of course, harm to ecosystems as well. This is a major environmental burden, especially in the aquatic environment where it's very apparent, but also on land where maybe it's a little bit less apparent. Now, the question becomes, does plastic biodegrade? Will it break down into its constituent elements? And the literature on this is not very clear. There's very limited literature. So we oftentimes hear plastic doesn't biodegrade, it only photodegrades. This is not entirely clear, but what is clear is whatever happens, it's on a very, very long time span. It's not like these plastics break down into components like the banana that I throw into my compost. It's not going to become part of the soil again, able to be used by plants and absorbed in that sort of way. You want to add anything there, either of you guys? No? Okay. So let's talk about how each of our disciplines approach this problem, and then we'll dig in a bit to how we got here and what we're up against and the solutions. So I'm a sociologist, and what we do in sociology is try and understand social problems in the broad social context. So we look at the culture, and that would include things like beliefs and values and attitudes and norms, foodways, technology, how all of those elements of culture contribute to creating a problem. So for example, the widely held belief that dilution is the solution to pollution is a contributor to this problem. People think, oh, I can just throw this and it's, the earth is big enough to absorb it all, which again is another misconception. Maybe if there were only 100,000 people or 1 million people on the planet, the earth could absorb all the waste that we create. But the reality is we've got over 7.5 billion people on the planet, all producing waste, including plastic waste, and the earth is no longer big enough to absorb all of the waste that we're producing, and yet people still think it is. So we look at culture. We also look at social structures, like what kinds of waste disposal systems are available. What are the laws related to the production, consumption, and disposal of plastic? All of those structural issues are something that we investigate as sociologists. And finally, we look at social institutions and how the various social institutions play a role. So how does the education system play a role in educating the public about environmental literacy and the problems we face? How does the economic system play a role? How does the political system play a role in contributing or solving the problem? And last but not least, we look at social stratification and how the division of people into layers based on power and prestige and property ends up leading to or contributing to the problem. So how is it that the least developed nations end up having more plastic waste perhaps going into the oceans simply because they can't afford to have proper waste disposal systems? So our vantage point from sociology is to explore what are the social causes of a problem so that we can then figure out what are the levers for solving those problems. And I'll let Brian and Helena talk about the sort of the vantage points that their disciplines would bring. Helena, why don't you go first?
Yeah, I was going to say I'll go because mine's kind of an extension of yours, Christine, because anthropology and sociology and geography for that matter are all really, they're really close related. And in classes, a lot of times when we get into conversations about the difference between, I always say that it's a matter of perspective, where with sociology, she talked about how like there's this broad kind of scope of looking at this issue, whereas in anthropology we kind of take that very from the bottom up kind of approach to those same social problems, and we're looking at the same social problems, but we would be asking questions like how do people within those cultures, how are there differing like worldviews when it comes to the use of plastics, or how they see, because when we looked at some of the maps that Brian showed us, like why are certain cultures in certain countries doing better with their consumption versus others? Like, are there particular cultural features that are in there? And then that also goes down into the individual behavior, right? And we're going to be talking here in just a minute about some of that individual behavior that folks within those cultures can, kind of what is it that's associated with those social problems? How do we connect those social problems down into that individual aspect of it? And then, of course, once we get that full picture of both like that macro and then that kind of micro view of these social issues, we then, especially within anthropology and also with the applied aspects of sociology and geography, we try to tackle those problems, come up with real world situations and solutions that can be applied to these things to help. And the thing is that's real important for us to understand, and anthropology brings this into focus is that there's not going to be one silver arrow that is going to take care of this problem. It's very contextual, depending on how the culture is organized around that social issue. So in this case, like what is their approach to plastics? Are they a contributor to the problem, or are they like just part of the global commodity chain? Right? I mean, these are very different. They're all connected, but they're different roles within that bigger system. And so the solutions that you would apply to these different systems and individual behavior isn't necessarily going to be the same across the board. And so that's something that really, from an anthropological point of view, you can contribute to this conversation, is really bringing it down into, well, what is it that, okay, we understand we have a social issue, but on a day-to-day basis, what does that look like for me or for you or for someone living in China for that matter, or in Vietnam? What does that behavior look like, both in the terms of contributing to the problem, but also, you got to understand what the problem is before we can find a solution to it. So, anthropology is really focused on, particularly, we have a whole branch of anthropology at this point that's focused on environmental issues. And environmental anthropology is a growing field because we have a lot of anthropologists that have come into the picture wanting to help with this and solve the climate issues that we have and environmental issues we have on the planet today. Because we only got one shot at this, right? I mean, there's just one planet. We don't have a second one and a backup. And so, this is something that in terms of the applied aspect of all of our disciplines is definitely something that we study from these kind of multiple vantage points, but also using that information to try to come up with solutions to help better this situation in the future, right? It's not necessarily just about pointing to the problem and saying we got a problem. It's also about saying, okay, where and what kind of solutions can we actually come up with that are actually realistic, right? Not ones that are just pie in the sky, right? Like that wishful recycling, right? That people often do. I mean, because like Christine was saying, with that particular situation, what we've got is, a lot of people do exactly what's called wishful recycling, right? We throw it in the recycling bin, kind of wishing like, is this recyclable? I don't know, right? And as we understand now that, it doesn't really matter even if it says that it's recyclable, right? You might even be throwing it in that and thinking that it's getting picked up and getting recycled, but in reality, the economy has actually carved out a niche for a business, model that actually takes advantage of that, right? Where you have certain companies that are coming by and picking up, right? Especially if you don't live in a municipality. And I still say municipalities are still getting taken advantage of that, because municipalities are picking it up and then sending it off and thinking that they're doing the right thing, but they're paying for that, and you're paying for that in your taxes, but then the companies aren't recycling them, right? They're not actually doing the recycling. So these are questions that we would be asking, from the anthropological lens of like, how can we as individuals, exert our individual agency on really trying to tackle this problem, and how is it realistic?
Yeah, how we got here, I think we all in some ways kind of see this in the same way, like y'all said, but you could take kind of a long-term kind of human history perspective, right? We have an industrial revolution that spreads around the world. We become reliant on fossil fuels in various ways, and then we try to find something to do with the waste from fossil fuel production. And I think that's an important thing to point out here, which is that these plastics, this is a way of making plastic is a way of monetizing waste from fossil fuels. There's certain compounds that come off of natural gas production and petroleum production that were sort of the push to develop this new material, right? Let's develop a new product, right? And plastic is durable and it's cheap, and so we all buy it, right? Another sort of aspect of this is to think about how we got here. This is a global problem, right? We are all so globally interconnected with the commodities we buy and with the waste that we produce, whether that's through natural systems like watersheds and ocean currents, or whether that's through economic systems. And so that's how we've gotten into this situation. And for the US specifically, we are now in a real fix, because it was very easy for us to say out of sight, out of mind if someone else was willing to take it. But when China declared that it was going to cut us off, we were really scrambling to find places to put this. And I think Christine mentioned this before. I mean, in the US, we really have not developed an infrastructure to collect, sort, and recycle these materials. We're pretty good at collecting it. We're pretty good at sorting it and cleaning it, but then we're used to putting it in shipping containers and sending it to Asia. And so that last piece, right, there's in some ways there's an economic opportunity there for someone to come in and start to develop the infrastructure to recycle this stuff. But is it cost effective? Can we catch up soon enough? All these kinds of things are obstacles to that solution. I mean, how we got here is sort of also the kind of what are we up against, right? We're up against a global problem. We're up against something that's gotten really bad without us really paying attention to it. And so we've got to clean it up and sort of think forward. Maybe we can sort of do what are we up against and move towards solutions. So since this is so depressing, but like I did read an article just the other day. It was published in Nature, so a well-respected scientific journal. It's from last year that someone at UC Berkeley has now developed this biodegradable vegetable-based plastic that decomposes in a regular compost bin in the back of your backyard within a week, 98%. So I don't know if you've seen these vegetable-based plastics. There's a coffee shop near my house, for example, that like has these vegetable-based plastics, but most of the ones on the market right now, if you throw them in the compost bin in your backyard, they'll still be there. They can biodegrade, but they can only do it over long periods of time or through like an industrial process. So what are we up against? We're up against stuff that doesn't go away. If we can potentially shift towards things that can biodegrade very easily, very quickly, that's a potential solution there.
So I'd like to sort of jump back to some of the reasons why we got here. And it's useful to think about the practical nature of plastic, right? It is so ubiquitous or ever present because it is so adaptable to any purpose. If you look around the room that you're in, you'll see plastic components in everything because you can turn plastic into a container to hold things that's not going to break down in the face of liquids. You can turn it into a toy. You can turn it into a computer. You can turn it into a chair. You can turn it into essentially anything. And so it's a very useful product. We are also a country that is a world increasingly that is very focused on convenience. So it's convenient to be able to have lightweight products that don't shatter, right? So, peanut butter jars used to be glass and now they're plastic, and it makes sense. What mom wants broken peanut butter jar in her kitchen, or dad for that matter, right? So it's a very convenient item. It's also been very cheap, right? The oil industry is well subsidized. Oil is one of the basic components that goes into the production of plastic. And so it's been incredibly cheap to make. And it's much more expensive to take the end product of the waste product and turn it into new plastic than it is just to produce it out of virgin materials. And that's where our beliefs as a country and our values in terms of economic development being paramount come in, right? We want to develop economically at all costs, regardless of what kinds of problems might come along the way. And in the process of our economic development, we sometimes turn a blind eye to the problems that are associated with that economic development. So there's a lot of cultural aspects that are at the base of how we got to where we are. Before I turn to social structures or social institutions, Brian and Helena, do you want to add any other sort of cultural aspects that you can think of that helped us get to where we are today?
Well, yeah, I think one of the things that I wanted to add to that is that, the systems that we live in, the globalized system itself and the West in general, those economic systems are geared towards short-term gains, not long-term solutions. And so, even when we come up with solutions, they're short-term solutions, and really the solution isn't necessarily to take care of the plastic problem, other than can I make revenue on the plastic problem, right? So we have in some cases this competing priorities when it comes to these solutions, right? So, is the solution about making it, and the argument will become, well, if we don't put it into a business plan, right, then it won't survive in the system that we have. But it really clouds, right, the ability for those things to actually be successful in the long run. And it also makes it much more easier for it to be corrupted. Because of the fact that there's other systems out there that are trying to do the same thing, right? And so, and then you also have, let's not forget, major industries, right, that go out of their way to prevent some of these things to happen too, right? I mean, the petroleum industry has lobbyists that will certainly make the case for legislation that might be for environmental things about plastic use and plastic pollution that would prevent those kinds of solutions to even happen because of the fact that it might be hurting the bottom line of that petroleum industry. So competing priorities, right, and the short-term nature of our economy.
Oh, great. That's a great one to bring up, Brian, right now.
Yeah, so on that sort of profit motive, lobbying, all that kind of stuff, I mean, the sort of two images here, I mean, one thing to acknowledge before we really look at these is that the US does not have any sort of national policy whatsoever on plastics or recycling in any way, shape, or form. It's been left to cities, it's been left to states, and to be honest, they have done a pretty terrible job of it. So on the left, you've got a different view of this, which is, countries that have sort of a national level policy, in this case, looking at countries that are banning plastic bags. And typically what that means is not that you can't get a plastic bag anywhere. It's just that, giving away free plastic bag production, right? There's some kind of cost associated with it, or some kind of penalty or tax or something associated with it as well. On the right is pretty interesting, which shows what's going on in the US right now, which is an attempt to, prevent more of this plastic pollution. And so the places in green are cities or counties that have placed some kind of ban on maybe straws or plastic bags or something specific. You've also got the states outlined in green that have a statewide version of that. But to the point that we've been making a moment ago, the places with the orange outlines are places where the petroleum industry has lobbied for a ban on bans, right? So this is a preemptive attempt to make it illegal in those states to ban plastics, even at the municipal level. And the ones with the solid yellow and sort of the blank are places where it's already passed. And the places with the green hash marks are places where it's being considered. And we did have an attempt in South Carolina, because the coastal counties have started to ban these plastic bags in coastal cities as well in South Carolina. And there was an attempt to push something through the legislature to prevent them from doing that. But apparently it violates the state's constitution. South Carolina state constitution has something called home rule that likes to leave things to local areas, likes to allow cities and counties to decide their own fate to a degree. And so it's been rejected as of now, but we'll sort of see. That's going to come up again for sure. Sorry, that was a bit of a rant, but a bit to be able to kind of look at the policy a little bit and think about how this fits in with industry desires and aspirations. Yeah.
And that's really something important to look at, is sort of the relationship between the individual behavior, the family behavior, the institutional behavior, but also between social institutions. So if we look at the various social institutions that play a role in shaping human understanding of this problem, we've got the education system, which doesn't do a particularly good job at this point of providing what we would call environmental literacy, or an understanding of the environment in which we humans survive and thrive, right? We have to have healthy ecosystems in order to be healthy humans, and yet our education system does a pretty dismal job of teaching most people that, and that's been the case, since its inception. Religion plays a role in this as well, right? In shaping an understanding of humans as the dominant species on the planet, creating the mentality that the earth was made for us and that we can do whatever we want with it. We've got an economic system, as we've talked about before, that is focused heavily on maximizing profit and on short-term gains, as Helena mentioned. We've got political systems that are somewhat beholden to the economic system because there's so much power in lobbying and campaign financing and those sorts of things. And so the politicians have a hard time, even if they want to, creating legislation that might deal with these sorts of problems. So the entanglement of all the different social institutions, and I could go into others, really helps us to understand how we got to the point that we're at. Looking at those sort of cultural and structural and institutional sources of the problem then gives us the ability to think about the kinds of solutions that we could aim for. More education about the problem, about all kinds of environmental problems, making it a part of public education from the ground up, right? Creating legislation that will solve these problems. And I do want to point to a positive development on this. And Brian, I'm going to steal the slideshow back from you because I need to find it in here. Because I won't remember the exact name of the legislation. Okay, so it's called the Microbead Free Waters Act of 2015, which was passed in the United States. And it actually prohibits the manufacturing, packaging, and distribution of rinse-off cosmetics containing those little tiny microplastics or microbeads. This is a relatively new law. It was it's only been implemented in recent years, but it's a really positive development. And this is the sort of legislation that a lot of countries are starting to look at in terms of, you know, what are we going to do to solve this problem that we face? So each time we can look at a cause, we can also look at a potential solution. If we think about the, you know, the convenience factor, maybe there's alternatives that are equally convenient to having a plastic container, for instance. Alternatives to having single-use plastic bags as well, and trying to build that into the culture, right? Making a culture where people, and I'm going to let Helena talk about carrying your own straw, but we can also talk about carrying your own plastic bags, so reusable bags. So Helena, take it from there.
Yeah, because there always becomes this question about what is it that I can do to even help this situation, because it seems like it's all, you know, doom and gloom. But the biggest thing I think that's important for us to realize as individuals is that we really need to start weaning ourselves off the disposable plastics. And I know that seems like it's harder, like it's easier said than done, of course, because, you know, we've already mentioned about how prevalent plastics are. But I would just remind you that the power within systems is inherently there by convincing you that you have none. So by telling you have no power, right, to be able to do something about this issue, you're just simply reinforcing what the, you know, those who've been making profits off of this and, you know, really haven't been working towards this and have, you know, kind of been, let's say, the bad guys of the situation. They keep winning that way, because then you effectively don't change your behavior or anything like that. But there's actually quite a few like small things that we can do as individuals that carry an enormous amount of agentic power, where we can start to take, and it's not just you, it's you and your family and your neighbors. And if we all individually, I mean, like you know, Christine said, you know, we have an enormous amount of people on the planet today. And, you know, in the United States, we have a very large population, 350 million, right? And so when we're looking at such a large population, and that we're the larger contributors to that, right? Americans particularly could do just a few small things on their day-to-day basis in their actions to kind of change these things, effectively make some change. For one thing, and Christine's already mentioned it, is you know, put your totes in your bag, in your car, guys, right? Use those when you go shopping instead of the plastic bags. You know, tell the cashier, no plastic bags, I've got my own bags. Carry reusable straws with you, right? I've got a couple of ones just to kind of show you some examples of these. I mean, there's several on the market, and you can usually find these at pretty much any big box store these days, or order them off the internet. But, you know, keep these handy in the car, right? So when you go through a drive-through with your kids, right, just say no to the straws, right? Tell them you don't need the straws. You've already got some straws, and the refusal of it. No, that doesn't mean that there wasn't a straw made, but you're not using it, right? And so that means that there's not going to be more made to replace the one that you use. Just some other ones like reusable plastic bags. You can get these, and these right here go in your dishwasher, or you can just rinse them out. I use these for my kids' snacks, because they have snacks every day. And so one of the things I've been looking for different ways to kind of cut back on my dependence of plastics. And I lecture about this in my 202 class too. So I've been working, you know, on these types of things personally, but these are great, guys. I mean, this one right here, I don't know how many times it's been used, but really good. How about reusable water bottles, right? Yeah.
And reusable lunch containers.
Mm-hmm. reusable lunch containers. And the other thing I would say too is even those that you get that are disposable plastic, like containers, like takeouts, those things can be reused again, right? So in some cases, like if we do have, like we find ourselves with the actual plastics, right? These one-use plastics, see if you can use them again, right? You know, I have a whole Tupperware set of takeout containers. That's right, Christine. That's all the Tupperware I have. I don't even have any really regular Tupperware. All my stuff is like that stuff that I reuse. Stop supporting companies with products containing microbeads. That's a really important one too. There's actually been quite a bit of movement on this within the consumer market, where we've seen a lot of the larger companies starting to make products without them because of the consumer pressure on this. But just remember, you as living in a consumer culture have consumer power. Don't underestimate your consumer buying power. Support public policies that restrict the single-use plastics. We already talked about, showed that map of some of those municipalities that have those laws in place that are restricting single-use plastic. Support those types of public policies. Cook more at home. These are actually quite simple, right? Cook more at home. This prevents you from like getting the takeout containers, right? And obviously you cook more at home. There's other benefits that can come along with that also, with just being, having a healthier diet, right? By cooking more at home. Support the use of secondhand items. Now, this is very counterintuitive to a consumer culture. I want you to know this. As a mother of 3, I can tell you that I have some coats and clothes that have been worn on by all 3 of my children and probably came to me used before that. Mainly because of the fact that I'm a huge proponent for secondhand stuff. And I think that by doing this, by having a second life to commodities, it allows for you're not having to deal with packaging on a new one, or like any of the other plastic stuff that's associated with that new product. If you're having someone reuse the product, right? So what does that mean? It means, gift your old clothes, guys, to someone who needs it, right? I've gotten so many great hand-me-downs for my kids. That's been just a very, very good one for me. Support NGOs and companies that make environmental issues a part of their mission statements. This is actually, we're starting to see that there is becoming more pressure on companies about being more environmentally responsible. And I want you guys to know that that's really something that's because of the consumer pressure. Okay, so the more pressure that we put on that, the more they're going to fight it and make sure that's profitable by any means. But it's important that we continue to support those that are working towards those environmental issues. And then, of course, and we've got one opportunity to kind of introduce to you today, volunteer in your community, take part in the actions that your community is doing, trying to protect the local environment. And always start local. Don't think big, right? Start with your neighborhood. Start with your street. Clean up some trash on your street, right? Start with your community. Start with something close to you. You don't need to think about doing some big project far away. Start really, really close to home. Okay. And
Brian, I lost that slide, so you're going to have to pull up the slide with your volunteer opportunity. I want to go back to a few things that Helena mentioned that came to mind as she was talking. So one of the things that I really recommend that people do is not think just of these specific examples, but think each time you're making a purchase, is there plastic involved in this? And do I have a choice? So when I go to the grocery store, instead of putting my produce in a plastic bag that's then going to go into another bag, I just put it in my cart, right? And then I put it on the belt, the belt at the register, and they never question me, right? They never say, well, why didn't you use a plastic bag to store this? It's just sort of matter of fact that that's the way things are going to go. When I purchased clothes, and I can't say I'm always very good at this because I like soft synthetic sweaters, but I try and think about is this product made with natural fibers, or is it made with synthetic fibers? Because interestingly enough, much of the plastic waste in the ocean is in the form of microfibers from synthetic clothing. So once I learned that, I really took a step back on some of my purchasing habits and started saying that maybe I don't need that soft sweater, right? Maybe I'm gonna choose something cotton. And I love a comment that one of our participants just made. This is from Elena Martinez Vidal, one of our humanities instructors, and she said that she loves clothes made from bamboo, and that's really a far superior choice to the soft synthetic fibers that I buy. When I'm purchasing, anything, I really think through, is this plastic something I need in my life, or is it just extraneous? And I try and make really careful choices about that. So giving it some thought can make a big difference. And, the other thing I wanted to add is the impact of consumer choices can be huge. Back in I think it was the early 80s, McDonald's used to still use what was called the styrofoam clamshell, so the little packages that hamburgers went in. And there was a consumer boycott, and McDonald's switched, right? They switched how they packaged their burgers. They switched to either paper wrappings or paper boxes, and there's been no going back. So we as individuals can have a huge impact, not just in terms of the choices that we make in our individual lives, but the consumer decisions that we make and the influence that we have on our public policy makers to make legislation to deal with these kinds of problems. Brian has up for us a slide about an upcoming event. So I'll let you guys talk about this, Brian, especially.
So yeah, I do some water quality monitoring stuff with the Gills Creek Watershed Association. And so we're going to do a stream cleanup on March 25th at 10 a.m. It's going to be along Timberlane Drive, which is pretty close to Beltline campus. It's a spot that was pretty heavily flooded in 2015. And there's some open space down there and some abandoned houses and so forth. There are a couple of ways you can sign up. I mean, one, I'll circulate a flyer later, so hopefully your teacher will share it with you. But if you want to scan the QR code up here, or if you want to go to the link that I put in the comments, I organize the event. I use this Eventbrite site. So it's going to ask you if you want to come to get a ticket. It doesn't cost anything. I just need to get a head count. I'll provide all the gloves and bags and all that kind of stuff. So if you're interested in joining us, you can scan here with your phone, or you can visit that link in the chat. I would say that, I mean, this kind of thing is, I think, helpful on the whole, and these individual decisions are really, really critical. To me, these are acts of conscience, right? Just sort of knowing that my behavior can sort of influence these kinds of things. But as we've said a couple of times, this is going to take more than individual action. We need real legislative action on this, not just at the national level, but at the global level. And things have got to change, right? ExxonMobil, Shell, Saudi Aramco, they've all got plans to ramp up their plastic production. They're going to try to double it by 2035. So those products are coming, and those things are in the
let's
pipeline,
talk about why.
in the pipeline.
I want to let you finish, Brian, but I want to talk about why that is. So as we reduce our consumption of fossil fuels for automobiles and for the production of energy, these petroleum manufacturers have a vested interest in still selling their product, and what their plan is to sell more plastic, right? Produce and sell more plastic. And so
right, yeah, that's the pivot, right? If you already control those fossil fuels and you can't sell them for automobiles anymore, then yeah, that's the pivot, right? Yeah.
Right. So so we as members of a democratic nation have the ability to have an influence on the kinds of public policies that shape our world. And as Helena said earlier, oftentimes we have this misconception that there's nothing I can do, I'm just one person. If we all think that way, then there is nothing that we can do. But as social constructionists tell us in sociology and probably the other disciplines as well, people have the power to construct the world we live in. And as members of a democratic nation, we have a lot more power than people who live in more autocratic political systems. If we want to see change, we can make change happen. And while it may be true that corporations have a lot of money to throw at politicians, if enough people become activated about an issue, politicians are going to create legislation that will appeal to us, not just to big corporations. And I'm not trying to slam big corporations because they obviously are in the game to maximize profits. That's the goal of a corporation in a capitalist economy. But we have to understand that we have some power as individuals, as well as individual members of a democratic nation, as individual consumers, etc. So don't feel like you're too little to make a change on these issues. If everybody who cares about these issues steps up to the plate in their personal life, in their professional life, and in their civic life, we can really bring about a lot of changes. So sorry, I jumped in there on you, Brian. You had some more things you wanted to say, I think.
No, you got it. You got it.
No,
You got it.
okay.
Yeah.
I'm going to go back to the other slideshow then, because we had a slide about non-governmental organizations that are working on these issues. So lest you think you're in this alone, you are certainly not. This is a list of environmental organizations, just some of them, and not exclusively environmental organizations. Some of them have other focuses as well, but that are focused specifically on the plastic waste issue. So there's a lot of really good work being done to try and activate for public policies, for cleanups, for stopping the production of plastic or slowing it down, for figuring out how to get the waste out of the oceans once it's in there, which is a really sticky wicket, right? You can't just send ships out to pick this stuff up because it's so amorphous and because it's so far out in the sea. So, so there's a lot of hard work going on, and you can check into some of that hard work that's being done at these websites. And I'll put that into the chat in case anyone wants to grab it. I do want to mention some of the things that some of the participants have mentioned. So Claire mentioned check out the Sunrise Movement. It's not something I'm familiar with, but she put that in the chat, so check that out. And Raina mentioned that she loves going for local made things, so she makes a conscious effort to find creative alternatives to using plastic. I think that's a really good point. Carmen asks, are paper straws really better? I think the answer is the paper straw wrapped in plastic? Right? If it's wrapped in plastic, it's not better. If it's truly just a piece of paper, then yes, far more biodegradable than a plastic straw. What other questions do our participants have, or comments that you guys want to make before we move on? If anything. Well, then I'm going to throw a question at Brian and Helena. What's the greatest sense of, what gives you the greatest sense of hope on this issue? I blindsided them with this question.
Hope?
Yes, hope.
I mean, I think I'm continually impressed with human innovation. And I say that while, I mean, I know I mentioned like the alternative plastics before, and I don't want to get into this sort of frame of mind where, oh, we can just keep buying whatever we want all the time and consuming all this single-use stuff. Like, we've got to make some changes in our consumption habits, right? But here's a little hopeful clip that we can kind of take note of. Christine, you mentioned how difficult it is to clean up this plastic that's in the ocean. And there are a bunch of different technologies that people have started up. Some of them were even designed by like middle schoolers as projects. And this is one of these nets. So you've got sort of two boats kind of hauling the net, and it sort of expands and fills up with that plastic. And here's the video of them sort of dumping it all out. You can kind of see what all they. So it's kind of simultaneously horrifying as well as hopeful that we are able to sort of, you know, come up with these solutions to these, what would have been considered a very insurmountable, impossible situation to clean up, you know, maybe a decade ago. Now all of a sudden we've got these tools at our disposal, right?
Yeah,
Helena?
I was going to say, I'd reiterate that. I mean, the problem that has been created with plastic, and we have to kind of remind ourselves that this is a problem that's happened in the last 100 years, right? The last century, because plastic itself is not even a commodity that is that old for human, you know, for human consumption. So what I find really kind of hopeful is the idea of how, like, we are talking about this more culturally, trying to find like individual solutions to the problems, and really making, you know, trying to make these solutions realistic for people to be able to actually implement within their lives. You know, you don't want it to be a situation where the change is so much, and this is actually something I talk about within, you know, within my classes, is like you change something too much and people aren't going to do it, right? It has to be, a change has to be something that's going to either improve upon what you already have or maintain what you have, right? Otherwise, people are just not going to be involved in that change. But it also has to be something that on an individual basis, that there is some sort of motivation, like other than, right? And I know most of us can be motivated by, right, the environmental aspect of it, but for the most part, right, in some cases, the environmental motivation is outweighed by an economic one, right? So there's these competing different kind of things. And I think that one of the things that I'm seeing that's hopeful is that we're recognizing those types of things. We're talking about them more. And our young people, I'm just like continuously impressed at how incredibly innovative our young people are. And you know, as speaking as the anthropologist kind of goes way back in time, talking about human innovation, most human innovation has been born out of necessity. So we haven't probably invented quite yet, the thing that is going to be the biggest solution and best solution to this plastic problem, right? So you know, we've got some tools already, you know, that have been innovated, that we can use, but there's going to be some new ones out there that people are going to come up with, and I'm really excited to see what that's going to be, because collectively we're coming together on this problem too, and that's something I find really hopeful.
I would agree. That gives me an incredible amount of hope. The number one, the innovative, creative, problem-solving nature of humans. If we could just get past the fighting with each other and get to the problem solving, we'd be in good shape. But also the fact that we have solved some pretty monumental problems as a global community in the past. The problem with the hole in the ozone is something that the global community came together on to solve, and that was really a tough one to get, you know, everybody on board with, and we managed to do it. I think the visibility of the plastics problem is such that people are becoming attentive to it more quickly than they might otherwise, and that it's leading to some pretty profound awakening on the part of not just little people like us, but, you know, big actors as well, corporate actors, government actors, those sorts of things. I want to add a few things that came up from our participants. So Isabella asked, how much of the ecosystem do you think we are saving by reusable receptacles instead of disposable plastics? I think on an individual level, Isabella, it's minuscule, but if you multiply it by 350 million people, or, you know, half the global population, suddenly if everyone starts thinking, what can I use as a reusable instead of a disposable here, we can make a huge impact. Megan asks, what degree do you think is best to obtain if you want to fight against climate change, or I would add other environmental problems after graduation? There are, as you say, Megan, there are a ton of degrees that one can pursue, because regardless of whether you're going into public policy, or you're going into business, or you're going into environmental science, or you're going into teaching, any field you go into, there's opportunities to incorporate sustainable development today. And Megan, I'm going to put my email address in here, and others are welcome to use it as well. I don't have the website off the top of my head, but there's a great website about degrees in sustainability that I'll share with you if you want to send me an email about that. Let's see. So Carmen asks, is buying canned soda instead of bottles better? Does it get recycled in a more efficient way or disposed of in the same way like plastic? Metal, especially aluminum, is highly recyclable. So if I have a choice of buying something in metal, especially aluminum rather than plastic, I choose that always. Glass is a little more iffy. It's not as economical to recycle as is metal, but metal really the best way to go. Would you guys agree? Yeah. And then Jonathan asks, how do we stop corporations from polluting? What do we do if they break their promise? So this is a really tricky one. We as consumers need to scrutinize the companies that we're supporting. We also need to have public policies that hold companies accountable, and that's where the power of us as citizens come into play. We've got to push for legislation that requires that these kinds of detrimental side effects, what are called economic externalities, get incorporated into the business plans and the accounting of these corporations, so that they have to do what's right for public health, not just do what's right for the bottom line. Brian and Helene, I'm going to let you address the last point here from Claire, and then we're going to wrap things up. So Claire asks, so my apartment complex doesn't collect recycling. I've been driving around with 2 boxes of recyclables for a while now because I don't want to throw it in the trash. Is there a place in Columbia that one could drop off recyclables? I know the Fort Jackson used to.
I put a link in there for Richland County. I mean, I just found it real quick, so I don't know if it's the easiest place to look, but there are plenty of drop-off sites, and each county has one. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that the biggest issues there, and I can understand how that feels, is like it's like I'm going to drop this off in the recycle. Is it gonna get recycled?
Right.
You know? And I
ask myself that every time I put my plastics in.
And I think that, yeah, that shouldn't discourage you from doing the recycling, because I know it's not a huge percentage that is actually getting recycled that we're doing, but don't let that discourage you from actually doing the recycling. I think that the better situation also too would be to like investigate what your municipality is doing with those recyclables, right? And if they're if it's a company that they're hiring or they're contracting, investigate that company, right, to see if they are, have any complaints about, poor business practices when it comes to that, because, just because they are still in business doesn't mean they don't have bad business practices. It's important to understand that, because if the system isn't necessarily holding them accountable, they're still going to keep doing it as long as they can.
All right, so I'm going to wrap up here, but I couldn't put it in the chat and have it on the screen at the same time. So I just put into the chat for you guys the information about non-governmental organizations and also some information about some videos that might be of interest to you. There's one on plastics in South Carolina. There's one about the plastics in the ocean generally. There's one that talks about how big the Great Pacific Garbage Patch is. There's one on explaining those gyres that Brian was talking about before. And then the final one is about the petroleum industry's focus on creating more plastics in the future and why they're so focused on that. I want to thank all of you for joining us today. I know we just made a small dent in helping you understand the problem, the causes and the solutions. I hope that you'll continue to explore this issue, and perhaps if you take one of our classes, we'll explore it more together. Again, thanks for being here today, and I hope that you all have a wonderful day, and don't lose hope. We have an enormous amount of power if we just use that power to make change. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
Thanks, guys.
Brian, do you want to stop